This is a production of Cornell University.
The title today, High Food Prices and Food Riots, is the global food crisis here to stay. Per?
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I'm sorry we don't have, there's at least one seat up here. I don't need to sit down for a while, so one person can come up here. I don't see any other seats. There are two handouts, or at least there were two handouts on the table back there. The PowerPoint presentation is on one, and then there's a two-page summary of what needs to be done in response to the world food crisis as I see it. I'm going to answer this question at the end, because if I answer it now, then presumably you have other and better things to do. But here's what we normally refer to as the global food crisis. It's the increase in food prices during the last few years, and that's exemplified by the dark line. You see that the dark line is up higher than it has ever been since 1961, and presumably before that as well. So we now have the highest food prices that the world has ever seen. Well, that is what the media tells us. That's really not true, because what really matters is the food price relative to other prices. So if you deflate the food price, you get the red line. So now you see we're not even close to where we were in the early to mid-1970s. The prices are much lower than they were in the mid-70s if you deflate by the general price level. So maybe we don't have a crisis. Well, if you're spending 50 to 60% of your income on food and your food prices go up, your nominal food prices go up by 200–300%, you have a food crisis, because you simply can't afford to buy the food that you could buy before. So it depends on where you are, depends on who you are, where you stand, depends on where you sit, as the political scientists are telling us. The last year or so, we've seen dramatic increases in the nominal food price. This shows the price index for food, that's the red line, and the price index, the price increases for cereals. In 1998 to 2000 was equal to 100. So you can read out of that graph that the cereal prices in June 2008 were somewhere between 250 and 300 in an index basis, meaning they're almost 3 times as high as they were in year 1998-2000. That's quite a dramatic increase. The food price increased by less than that, but still it was more than a doubling between the end of the last century, 1998-2000, and June 2008. These are the numbers in terms of dollars per ton, and if you prefer to go by bushels, by dollars per bushel, you just divide these numbers by 40. What's important here is not so much the actual number, but rather what has happened since 1993-94. And if you look at wheat, you see more than a doubling in the price. These again are nominal prices. If you look at maize, which to some is corn, internationally corn is called maize, so I'm going to use maize, almost a doubling of the maize price, and an increase of about 60 or so, 65% in rice prices during that 5-year period. However, during the last little more than a year was when things really started moving. If you look at the green line, you'll see a dramatic increase in rice prices, up to almost $1,000 a ton, up from around $300 a ton back a little more than a year ago. Tripling a rice price in a matter of less than a year. It reached its max around April, and it has been falling since then. I'll come back towards the end and show what has happened since June 2008. What is actually happening today. The wheat prices reached their max in March, up to close to $500 a ton, and the rice price and the maize prices have been going up, and they were still going up more or less at the end of June 2008. Things have happened since then, which I'll talk about a little later. So what brought all this about? Let's look at the supply side factors first. Adverse weather. Droughts, consecutive droughts over 2, 3, maybe 4 years in parts of Australia, drought in Ukraine, drought in parts of the United States, and in a number of other important wheat-producing areas. Was that part of climate change? Is that climate change starting to bite? I don't know. What I do know is that we have increasing fluctuations in weather patterns resulting in more floods, more severe floods, more droughts, more severe droughts. Is that part of the climate change? You figure it out. Rapidly falling prices between 1974 and 2004, during that 30-year period, the real, that is deflated, food prices dropped by 75%. Dropped by 75% over a 30-year period. Why? Partly because of the success of the Green Revolution that resulted in expanded production of rice, wheat, and to a lesser extent maize. Partly because of the OECD agricultural subsidies. And OECD, as you know, is the rich country clubs in the United States, European Union countries, etc. And you are familiar, I'm sure, with the subsidies that brought about additional production and dumping on the export markets at prices below cost of production in many cases. Those two things, of course, increased supplies and reduced prices. And because of these dramatic price reductions, many countries, particularly developing countries, did not make investments in rural areas. Why should they? They got cheaper and cheaper food every day. Tomorrow it's cheaper than it was yesterday, so why make huge investments in rural areas in agricultural development when you have a strong need for that money somewhere else? So very little investment was made in most of the developing countries. That, of course, the result of that was that when you began to see a slowing down in the supplies, there was very little buffer to take up that reduction. Let's look at the demand side. Thanks in part to large subsidies for biofuel production in the United States and to a lesser extent in the European Union, there was a dramatic increase in the demand for maize, for soybeans, for rapeseed, and to a lesser extent for oil palm, for production of biofuel. So you had a dramatic increase in the demand for these food commodities for purposes other than direct consumption. That, of course, contributed to pushing up prices. IFPRI claims that about 30% of the increase in food prices are actually due to the biofuel programs around the world. It's very difficult to estimate these things. 30% seems a bit high to me, but who knows? Whether it's 25 or 30% probably doesn't matter much anyway. Secondly, on the demand side, there's been a rapid increase in the demand for foods of animal origin, that is meat and dairy products, in rapidly growing low-income countries, such as China, such as India, and a number of other countries, both in East and particularly in East Asia. That was a long-term trend which put a lot of pressure on the price for feed grain, because much of the production that was needed to satisfy these increasing demands was based on feed grain use. So feed grain demand went up, pushed up prices for soybeans, maize, and a few other feeds. Thirdly, market forces. The food stock has dropped quite significantly over the last few years, and nobody seemed to pay much attention to that except FAO. FAO kept saying, look, the stock is falling, this is risky because we have little buffer, and if something goes wrong out there in terms of bad weather or dramatic increase in demand, the two things we just looked at, there's very little buffer to avoid a rapid increase in price. And that is, of course, exactly what happened. The stock was drawn down to very low level. It's not as though the world is going to run out of food tomorrow morning. There's plenty of food in the world, but of course it's adjusted by increasing prices. Secondly, capital market transfers are very important in this business, And I'm referring particularly to transfer of capital from the real estate market in the United States to the raw material, to the commodities markets. There was a dramatic increase in the purchase of futures for raw material, not just food, but also oil, of course, and the metals, silver, gold, and so on. And those prices were pushed up because there was so much capital available for moving in to the commodities market. And as the commodity prices began to increase, the owners of that capital saw an opportunity for making money where they, much more so than they could in the risky real estate market. And then, of course, you have the falling dollar value. The dollar value relative to other currency has decreased dramatically. And I want to illustrate the importance of that. If you look at the top line, the dark line, what you see is FAO's food price index, which we already looked at. That's in dollars. Now, if you look at the red line, you see the increase in food prices expressed in a basket of currencies. In other words, you adjust the dollar on the basis of a basket of currencies. Now it doesn't look too bad. Now if you adjust the dollar value relative to the CFA exchange rate, which is effectively equal to the euro exchange rate, it doesn't really look like a crisis anymore. You could look at the blue line. It's below what it was in the mid-90s. It's certainly way below what it was in the 70s. So it all depends on what currency you are using. What's important here, of course, is the people that are going to be affected by that. Are they linked up to the dollar, or are they linked up to some other currency? And that has a lot to do with the extent to which these dollar price increases have actually affected people in developing countries. And I'll come back and talk a little about that because it relates to the transmission of the international prices to the low-income households or to any households in the various countries. And I'll come back and talk about that. The last set of causes of food price increases is something we don't talk very much about. We generally talk about supply and demand, and as economists we think that takes care of the full story. Well, of course it doesn't. There's quite a bit of public and private action that contributed to the food crisis or to the increasing food prices. First of all, there's been very little action towards achieving the Millennium Development Goal for poverty and hunger alleviation. What does that have to do with the food crisis? What it has to do with the food crisis is that by not making the investments in rural areas of developing countries that were needed to achieve the Millennium Development Goals, many developing countries did not have the infrastructure, they did not have the technology, they did not have the primary health care necessary to respond when prices began to go up some 3 or 4 years ago. Therefore, there was very little response from those countries when the prices began to go up. So you could argue that, well, why link it to the Millennium Development Goals? Why don't we simply say many developing countries ignored the needed investments in rural areas? Sure, fair enough. That's exactly what they did. Something else that had a great effect on the food prices, export bans and export restrictions, and related to that, panic buying. Let me talk a little bit about the rice situation, and I'll show you a picture that illustrates what I'm saying. Because of the droughts and a few other things, the wheat prices began to go up early on. The Indian government, which imported wheat, said, look, we're not going to increase imports of highly priced wheat, so we are going to put an export embargo on rice. They are a major rice exporter. By putting a ban on exporting of rice, they could keep rice prices low within India, and therefore they expected a substitution away from wheat towards rice among the consumers. There's a little more political economy to that, but that's at least part of the explanation. That's what set off this tremendous increase in rice prices. it was not that suddenly there was less rice in the market. No, there was plenty of rice. But there was less rice in the international market because India decided not to export for a period of time. That scared Vietnam, because guess what? If the Vietnamese government is part of a situation where the Vietnamese consumers suddenly have to pay a lot more for rice, they are likely to be in some trouble. Well, not as much trouble as the Philippine government would be in. They are net importers of rice, and Philippine governments have fallen because of rapid increases in rice prices in the past. The rice price is very important for government legitimacy in some countries, including the Philippines. So the Philippine government got scared, and they said, we're going to import now because it looks like prices are going to continue to go up. So they tendered at $700 a ton. Thailand was smart. Thailand is a major exporter of rice. They stayed cool, and they said, fine, we will take as much as we can get, but we're not going to close our exports. Philippines then got scared again, and they issued another tender for $1,100 per ton. That's a lot of money. But it's worth paying that kind of money in order to maintain your seat in government, I suppose. So there's clearly a government legitimacy issue. So the rice price was pushed up, not so much because we were short, not so much because of supply and demand factors, but for political reasons. Now, there were many other countries that joined in. Cambodia, for example, discontinued export, and a number of other countries enter in. The reason I'm spending a little time on that is it's very important that we don't look at the government only as a solution to problems, but also sometimes as the instigator of the problems, as in this particular case. Now, if you're sitting in the Philippines, you might have been doing the same thing because you first and foremost worried about what's going to happen to rice prices within Philippines. You probably don't worry too much about the international rice prices unless you have to import, as the Philippines, of course, did have to do. As part of that same game, a number of countries have had import tariffs on food, and they reduced the import tariffs in order to reduce the domestic prices in their various countries. That, of course, further added to the demand for food and pushed up prices even further. Now, I mentioned earlier that governments are sometimes part of the problem. And here is another illustration of that. What governments in many countries did, they slammed a price controller, and they said, no, 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 no. We don't want food prices to go up anymore. We're going to put a max price on. We're going to put price control. And if that doesn't work, we're going to ration. In fact, if it does work, we're going to ration, because if they put a price control on below the market price, then, of course, people will queue up. There has to be another allocated mechanism. So rationing was one of the things they did. People began to take to the streets because food prices were going up. That, of course, threatened government legitimacy in a number of countries. Haiti has been cited widely as a country that has been exposed to very severe food riots, burning cars and doing all of the things that rioting people do. The story really is quite different for Haiti than what reaches the surface. Haiti is a very important middle country for illegal drug transfer from Latin America to the United States. There was one person in government who was very eager to stop that transfer, that movement of drugs, and that was the Prime Minister. So when the food prices began to go up, and the Haitians became quite unhappy about it, because particularly those that were low-income urban people, the drug traders started paying people for taking to the streets and burning cars. As long as they would say they were demonstrating in the name of high food prices, which they did. And they demanded that the Prime Minister step down. The Prime Minister had nothing to do with the food crisis, but he had everything to do with the drug trade. And they were paid to make those requests, and guess what? The Prime Minister stepped down. In Egypt, there were lots of food riots. They were in response primarily to the government's attempt to reduce food subsidies. Egypt has had food subsidies, huge food subsidies, for many years. and they were trying to reduce that. It happened to coincide with increasing food prices, not a good timing, but the government, the people took to the streets to demonstrate against what the government was attempting to do, and of course again it was called food riots. Hoarding was quite common. Even in this country, you could see people going to the supermarket buying twice as much basic food staples they would normally buy, because guess what, we never know when it's going to run out. Sam's Club and I believe there was one other retail store, chain store, that decided they were going to ration some parts of the rice available in the stores, and that of course hit the news media, and guess what, we had a media frenzy. That was really good stuff. We are now going to ration rice because we are probably going to run out of rice in this country. Things are really bad, and look at how rice prices are going up, and you better run into Sam's Club and get as much rice as you can, run out, put it in the car, and then run in and do it again. The point I'm making is, of course, it didn't work. I don't know if it was intended to work, but it certainly wasn't implemented. It didn't last for very long. It was only one kind of rice. It wasn't all of the rice. The point I'm making here is there was a lot of panic going on, and the media contributed to that in a very significant way. Now, you do want the media to draw attention to the food problem. So it is a bit of a balance to figure out where exactly does the media action become unproductive. And clearly some of it was unproductive because people behaved, they changed behavior of people in a way that probably wasn't conducive to solving the food problem. Consequences of the food price increases. Let's look first at the household welfare change. The urban consumers, as net buyers of food, of course, were paying more for the food, so therefore they were losing. It depended a lot on which consumer we were looking at. The consumer that spent a large share of his or her budget on food, of course, was very seriously and negatively affected. And the consumer that produced primarily, consumed primarily commodities with very little processing, those consumers were very negatively affected. And let me show you, that just illustrate what I'm talking about. This is the percentage change in the consumer price index for food in selected countries during a one-year period from February 07 to February 08. In Sri Lanka, the consumer price index for food went up by 25%. In OECD countries, it went up by about 5%. In this country, it went up a little more, roughly 5.4% or thereabout. Why that huge difference? Because what we are consuming in high-income countries is so heavily processed. What we are paying for is what happens after harvest to a very large extent. I have this quote from USDA that says that if the maize price, corn price if you like, if it doubles in the United States, your cornflake price will go up by 1%. Now, if you are eating the corn instead of eating the cornflakes, your price would presumably double as well. There's a 2% increase in soft drink prices because, of course, they're using sweetener, corn maize sweetener. But the point I'm making here is that developing countries were affected much more severely for two reasons. One, the budget share is much higher among low-income people. That's also true for low-income people in this country, some of whom spend up to 30% of their income on food. So low-income people were much more seriously affected because they tend to have a larger budget share, and because they tend to have what they pay, a larger share of what they pay is related to the commodity, to the raw material, and that's where the pricing increases occurred. Food security and dietary quality. There was a study done recently that claimed, that showed actually that when prices go up among low-income people, they would tend to switch from the food commodities with higher content of micronutrients to more food staples with higher energy content, but they would then end up being more deficient in some of the micronutrients, meaning that the dietary quality would deteriorate, and of course food security would deteriorate along with it. Now the rural population groups, of course, they're all farmers and they're all selling food, so therefore they're all better off. No, not so. Depends on whether they're net sellers or net buyers. But aren't all farmers net sellers? Of course, that's why they're in business. No, they're not. This, I just picked a few countries to show the distribution. This shows the percent of rural households that are net stable food sellers in selected countries. Look at Malawi, for example. Only 12% of the rural households actually sell food. The rest, they are net sellers of food. The rest are net buyers. More may sell, but they will buy more back during the year. So on the average, for 12 countries for which I have data, about 1/3 of the households are net sellers, 2/3 are net buyers. The net buyers would be affected like consumers, because they are, of course, we're all consumers, but because they're net buyers, they would be negatively affected. The length of run is very important, because we can argue that in the short term, all of these farmers that are net buyers of food are made worse off by price increases. However, that should not lead us to the conclusion that therefore low food prices are better than higher food prices. Because in the longer term, the only way for many of those rural households to escape poverty is to produce more, is to increase productivity on the farms if they have land, so that in fact they can become net sellers. One of the reasons that so many farming households are net buyers is that the prices have been so extremely low. So in the longer term, we are likely to have what the economists call induced innovation, meaning as prices go up, more and more farmers will improve their productivity and move into the category of net sellers. So to an extent, this is a transition problem. How do we help the small farmers in the short period of time until they can become net sellers of food? I mentioned price transmission. By price transmission, I'm talking about the extent to which changes in the international prices are transmitted to consumers and producers in the various countries. So let me show you a few numbers on that. This shows the estimated price transmission for rice from the fourth quarter of 2003 to the fourth quarter of 2007 for selected countries. And again, I have data for more countries. I picked some to give you a distribution. The first data column is the change in the domestic price over the world market price in dollars. The number 6 that you see for the Philippines simply means that only 6% of the change in the international dollar price for rice was transmitted to the Philippine producers and consumers. Only 6%. If you look to the, and so on, you can go down the column. China is the highest with 64% of the dollar price change in the international market transmitted to national producers and consumers. The other column, the column to the right, is the domestic price over world market prices in domestic currency. So that takes care of any changes in exchange rates, and there, of course, you see higher numbers, but still, except for Thailand, which is a major rice exporter and therefore didn't have any, the price transmission was complete, basically. But except for Thailand, look at Vietnam, for example, only 12% of the change in the world market price in Vietnamese currency, when you measure it in Vietnamese currency, only 12% was transmitted to the national producers and consumers. Now this ought to give us something to think about, because obviously the effect, the effect is much less than if we simply say we assume that the full dollar price in the international market is transmitted to everybody in the various countries. So the impact was much less than it would otherwise have been. Production costs went up partly because of increases in oil prices. Fertilizer prices have increased dramatically. Energy prices used in agriculture gone up dramatically. So there were increases in production costs as well. The national welfare change, again, it comes to the question of, are countries net exporters or net importers? But keep in mind the length of run. And when people say most of the African countries are net importers of food and therefore they are negatively affected by any increase in food prices, what we're doing is we're basing our conclusion on a short-term static analysis. And if we stick with that, we're never going to help Africans out of poverty. We have to look at a dynamic longer-term analysis. What would happen in the somewhat longer term would be that countries would respond to those higher prices by investing in rural infrastructure, by investing in ag research and technology. Farmers would pick this up and produce more. Again, it's the same argument I made before. It's a question of how we get from here to there. But simply throwing up your hands and say, let's see if we can't get food prices pushed as low as absolutely possible because that's good for Africa. That's a very short-term and very incorrect conclusion. What, of course, is also important to these countries is how much they depend on imports. Because take Malawi, for example, it only depends on grain imports for about 7% of what it consumes, whereas in Eritrea it's 88%. Now, most of that is probably food aid, but nevertheless, the dependence is there, and of course, availability of food aid goes down when food prices go up. So each country will be affected differently depending on on how much it depends on import. Stability, we talked about food riots. Governments are very concerned about changes in food prices that may result in reduced perceived legitimacy of the sitting government. Governments are very concerned about that, and that's one of the drivers of the decisions they make. Agribusiness made out great in this business. Just about any effective or efficient agribusiness corporation you look at has increased its net profits quite dramatically during the last 2 or 3 years. We can talk a bit about that afterwards, but obviously the question, it's very similar to the oil companies. When the oil prices went up, the oil companies made a lot more money than when the oil prices went down. And it's a similar situation here. It's a matter of the lag between the purchase price and the selling price by the agribusiness corporations. Now, let's look at also the policy response to food price increase. And I mentioned already the question of government legitimacy. For most governments, that's the most important goal, not alleviating poverty, but maintaining legitimacy. And because of that, most governments have emphasized short-term measures. Price controls I already mentioned, export bans I mentioned, lifting import tariffs I mentioned, rationing, food distribution to people who are important for government legitimacy. Very short-term measures that may have very negative long-term consequences. Governments have emphasized short-term transfer to urban lower middle class. They continue to neglect the rural poor. When food prices were low, there was a lot of hunger and poverty in rural areas primarily. About 75% of the hungry people were in rural areas. When food prices increased, the people in the rural areas continued to suffer. They suffer a little more. But those who took to the streets and threatened government were the urban lower middle class. And therefore, if you were in charge of a government and you were trying to maintain legitimacy, you would focus your policy measures on that group and not on the rural poor that are not really threatening you. And the other response that we see is a renewed interest in national self-sufficiency. And this is particularly a result of what happened in rice that I showed you earlier. Can we, as a country, really afford to continue to depend on international trade when there are no rules against suddenly stopping export of what we need to survive? And I can imagine that's something the government of the Philippines have been talking a lot about. There is a desire to increase self-sufficiency in a number of countries, and one of the interesting ways that some of the higher income countries are doing that, such as Saudi Arabia, is to try to gain control of land in other countries. So they're moving into other countries, trying to get control over land and water that will produce something that they have first right of refusal to, in the sense that it is almost like annexing those resources to your own country, but of course they're not doing that from a nationalistic perspective, but simply to have an assurance that there's food there if they need it. Reserve stocks. There's much more discussion now about creating reserve stocks. Why don't we just have a lot of food piled up so that if we have another drought or another biofuel subsidy program, we can just take all that food out of the shop. So that's one of the policy responses. Now, let me talk a little about what I'm proposing be done. Not that it matters much, but anyway, you can take it for what it's worth. For short-run impact, we need food distribution targeted on the poor, but not just the urban poor, also the rural poor. There are lots of people out there that are suffering. The World Bank is claiming that they have estimated that 100 million more people are going to fall back into poverty. When you have round numbers like that, I'm suspicious. But nevertheless, a lot of people are going to be poorer than they were before, and a lot of people are suffering. They simply cannot get access to enough food. Food distribution, poverty relief programs for the poor, rural and urban, safety nets for rural and urban poor, rural public works. The kinds of things that are needed to solve the immediate problems that these people have before them. Time-limited input subsidies. I think it would make a lot of sense to have time-limited input subsidies, for example, for fertilizers and seed in countries where that is likely to alleviate some of the current high food prices. It should be time-limited in the sense that it should not be another unsuccessful OECD agricultural subsidy kind of program that never ends, but it could be, for example, a 2-year program or a 3-year program until the necessary infrastructure investments have been made so that fertilizer prices and seed prices would be lower. Discontinuation of export bans, very, very important. It is amazing to me that we have discussed trade liberalization for agriculture for I don't know how many years, but nobody has ever suggested, as far as I know, or at least nobody has ever agreed, that we should have an agreement that would prohibit ad hoc export bans. They do a lot more harm than some of the subsidies that we're trying to get rid of. Yet that is off the table. There is a big pile of rice in Japan that Japan was forced to import as part of a WTO agreement, the World Trade Organization agreement. It is the kind of rice that the Japanese don't want to eat, so it's just sitting there, and it's been sitting there for quite some time. There's a lot of it. In order to release that on the market, the Japanese need agreement from WTO. They certainly need agreement from the United States, but I think they need agreement from other WTO members as well, if I'm not wrong. That rice is still sitting there. The Japanese took upon themselves to release a small portion of it to the Philippine government to import, but there's still a lot of rice sitting there. That ought to be released before the rats eat the rest of it. We need to postpone biofuel blending mandates that we have in the United States and the European Union. These mandates put a lot of pressure on using soybeans and maize for biofuel, and this is the wrong time to do it. We need to eliminate the biofuel subsidies. Mind you, some of these things would be somewhat controversial politically. For the long term, for the long run impact, something we need to start now, but it will have long-term impact. Expanded investment in rural areas. This is what some of us have been saying for the last many years. It's nothing new. Still has to be done. Rural infrastructure, ag research and technology, rural education, sanitation, healthcare, and alternative energy sources. Do we really have to use our food supplies to generate energy when the carbon footprint doesn't decrease, when it causes havoc to food prices, or are there other ways? So it seems to me that the alternative energy source question is very closely linked to the food question. It would be wonderful if we could complete the Doha round discussion so that we could get some serious trade liberalization. And as I mentioned before, it makes very little sense in my book to maintain a situation where countries at will, ad hoc, can decide to ban exports. Can you imagine what would happen if the US suddenly decided to ban export of wheat and maize? What that would do to the rest of the world? Well, we're doing a little bit of that by taking a lot of the maize and putting it into biofuel, but at least it's not a total export ban. I think we need something like an international grain storage agreement, but it is a very tricky thing because it has to be maintained sufficiently small and sufficiently flexible and sufficiently apolitical so that it can be used as a buffer. As a minimum, we ought to have an agreement so that the grain stocks don't fall below a certain limit. Something would trigger expanded storage when that happens. Very difficult to manage, and I put this in with hesitation, and I think it's the last bullet, which can easily be taken out if you tell me over the next 10 minutes that 10 minutes is not going to work. So what are the future perspectives? We're going to see a very significant supply response by world agriculture, much bigger than the news media will have us believe. It is already beginning to happen. That, of course, would increase supply. It will push down the prices. The world food prices will fall. We are already on a new trend of falling world food prices. Yes, we will have blips. We will have blips. But the world food prices are on a downward trend, and I think that's where they're going to stay. Let me just give you a couple of examples on what has happened during the last few months. I said I would. These are the approximate wheat prices. In January 2000, $100 a ton. In January 2007, $200 a ton. In February 2008, $500 a ton. In August 2008, $300 a ton. The dollars per bushel are shown next to it. Right now the prices of wheat, as I said, is roughly $7.50 a bushel. Depends a little on where you look and what market it is and what kind of wheat and so on. So you see a dramatic increase and an equally dramatic decrease over a very short time period. What is it going to look like a year from now? I'm not going to predict that, except to say it's going to be considerably lower than $300 a ton. Are we going to get back to the prices we had in year 2000? Probably not. And those prices were actually below the cost of production in many locations, and we probably shouldn't try to get back down that low. Now, this shows the percentage decrease in price between the peak, the highest level, and a few days ago, September 5. For wheat, there has been a decrease in 42%. For maize, about 31%. For soybeans, about 28%. The rice price hasn't come down much yet. And the reason is that some of the major rice exporters haven't quite given up their export restrictions. But they will as soon as they have a good rice harvest. Then those restrictions would have to go, and then the rice price would come down. Is that going to be in October or February? Who knows? If I knew that, I would probably make a lot of money between now and then. But nevertheless, it is going to come down, I have no doubt. Now, look at these percentages and compare them to the 100%, 200%, 300% increase, and you say, well, but you know, that's nothing. I mean, they're still very high. I want to remind you of a little bit of arithmetic. If something goes up by 100% and falls by 50%, it's right back on where it started. Okay? If it goes up by 200% and drops by 66%, it's right back where it started. Strong links between oil and food prices, very clear, very clear. As long as we insist on producing biofuel from food raw material, there will be a very close link. There will also be a close link between oil prices and cost of production in agriculture. So for those two reasons, we can expect a much stronger link than before. These are estimates made by Tyner and Taripur. These are not my estimates, but they are they are those that I could find. And basically what they show is that at a crude oil price of $100 per barrel, which is roughly what we have, what we had yesterday. Today it may be a little higher because the OPEC action yesterday. But at $100 a barrel, maize prices would have to be lower than $5.74 a bushel in order for it to make sense to use maize in biofuel, and that is exactly where they are today, give or take a few cents. So right now, if the oil price drops below 100, they're below the break-even price, and farmers would be better off selling the maize for something else than biofuel. So that's what is meant by the break-even prices. If the oil prices go up to $150, then of course the maize prices the break-even price would increase as well. So that establishes a very strong link. Continued urban bias in policy intervention, I'm afraid that's what we're looking at. That's what we will be looking at for the reasons I have already mentioned. And if food prices go down as fast as I think they will over the next year or two, then governments might return to complacency and say, all right, there wasn't really a crisis to begin with, we're doing fine, so let's just ignore food, agriculture, and all that comes with it. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're at the end of our hour, so those who need to sneak off to another class, feel free to do so. However, those who can stay, I'm hoping that Per can share another 10 minutes or so for questions.
Sure.
I'll let you call on.
Okay. Yeah.
You mentioned that you see this response to governments to improve agriculture or some 3 or 4 slides back. What response are you really seeing? You know, as a result of this crisis, are you really seeing an improvement in agriculture practices?
No.
Are you seeing it?
No. What I'm seeing is an effort to get more control, an effort by countries that are major net importers or that depend a lot on import of food and don't have their own resources, to gain control through contracts or various other forms. Saudi Arabia, but there are several other countries in that category. Then the other trend I'm beginning to see is, and that's at the discussion stage at this point, politicians saying, look, we can't really depend on small farmers to solve this problem. I mean, see what a mess they got us into in the first place, not recognizing that it was their problem that caused the problem. So therefore, we probably have to, quote, commercialize agriculture. So let's have some big chunks of land, and let's put some big machines on, and let's just forget about what happened in the Soviet Union. That's what I'm seeing. That's not very optimistic, I know. What I don't see is what I think both you and I would like to see. Now, heavy investments in rural infrastructure, in research and technology, in primary healthcare in rural areas. I don't see that. Yes?
You mentioned early on that capital market transfers were a problem in the market aspect. You didn't mention anything in your policy discussions about what to do about that.
No, because I don't know what to do about that. Seriously, I don't know what to do about that. I don't have the qualifications. I don't have the knowledge to suggest what should be done in the Chicago market, in the futures market. I really don't. Should there be restrictions or not? I generally believe in the market for those kinds of things. There's certain other things I want the government to deal with, but no, I really don't know. Do you know?
No, that's what I was asking.
Yeah. I don't.
You were kind of talking about like national food sovereignty and the movement towards that, and then you kind of were vehemently adverse to this shutting down of exporting and things like that. And I was just wondering how you think that those two things can be linked together, because like if you're looking at just increasing exports and continually like producing for the world market, and yet you're talking about like food sovereignty on a national level, I'm not sure how they can work together.
I did not talk about food sovereignty at all. I didn't mention the word. I talked about self-sufficient. That's a very different thing. That's a very different concept. I'm scared about self-sufficiency because it's extremely expensive for many countries to maintain self-sufficiency. Just imagine that Denmark has to produce its own bananas. So self-sufficiency, well, the Netherlands are producing a lot of stuff in glass houses that are so much more expensive to produce than if they would produce it where the climate is there. So we're not going to produce bananas in Denmark, but nevertheless. So self-sufficiency, I think, is just the wrong way to go. Food sovereignty is a wonderful thing if you define food sovereignty as the ability of a country or a household to acquire the food it needs. Absolutely, whether it's own production or import or whatnot. Here's the problem. If I have food sovereignty as an importing country, and I depend on India or Vietnam or Thailand to import my rice, let's say, and they have the right to suddenly say, sorry, no more rice from us, that's bad. Now your food sovereignty has been done away with. That's what I think we need to deal with. So I'm all in favor of food sovereignty. I'm not in favor of any one major exporter having the ability to just kill your food sovereignty. Does that help? Yes?
Yes, I was intrigued with your comments about the long-term benefits for African farmers with the rising food prices. And but I wonder how you reconcile that with calling for the completion of the Doha round and the full liberalisation of agricultural trade, which has had an effect on reducing prices, of course.
Yeah. The point here is the same as the one I was making about induced innovation, that if we could liberalize agricultural trade, the international prices would go up. That would induce more production in low-income countries. Take the example of cotton. If West African countries who can produce cotton at cost way below what we produce cotton at in the United States, if they were permitted to compete with American cotton producers on an equal playing field, as they used to say in Washington, then they would be much better off. So that price increase would result in much more dynamism in developing country agriculture. Now, here's the problem. To get from where we are now to there requires investment in infrastructure and research and credit programs and all of these things. So there's a period of time when those countries that are now net importers would lose. And that, of course, is what's always brought up in this debate. And it's a short-term static comparison saying, guess what? Africa is a net importer of food, and therefore if food prices go up, Africa loses. Yes, today they lose. But are we going to keep them at that level forever and ever? Or are we going to help them raise above that by giving them the price that the market will bear rather than the price that's determined by our subsidies? Yes?
I have a question on all you mentioned the different factors where you see for price increases, and you mentioned OECD policies.
Yes.
But you haven't talked about food aid as such. Do you see an impact of changes in food aid patterns from OECD countries as having an impact on the price?
Well, food aid is a double-edged sword in the sense that food aid may be extremely helpful in short-term emergency situations if it's handled with care. If it comes, not necessarily by care, but with care. It could be handled by care too. If it comes in at the right time and it's discontinued at the right time, it can be very, very effective in avoiding major human disasters. If it comes in late or it overstays its welcome, it can ruin the agricultural sector in the recipient country. Now, the higher food, there is a very strong correlation between the amount of food aid available and the international food price. When the international food price goes up, food aid tends to disappear and vice versa. So when food aid is mostly needed, there's less of it. Now, we can talk about food aid for a long time. Food aid should be purchased locally. It should be purchased in the regions where it's needed to the extent that you can find a country that's capable of producing that additional food, rather than shipping American food into developing countries. That, again, is an old story that made sense maybe it never made sense, but it made more sense back when we had huge surpluses of food sitting in government warehouses. We don't have that anymore. So when we ship food aid from the United States, the government goes out and it buys the food in the open market, and then it ships it overseas on American carriers, which charge much more, the freight charge is much higher than if it were competitive freight. So there are all kinds of interesting things. Chris Barrett just wrote a book. Chris Barrett, for those of you who don't know him, is a professor in AIM. He just wrote a book on food aid, and it's really a great book if you're interested in food aid. Yes?
2 points. I think you mentioned future perspectives that the prices are reducing.
Yes.
So we noticed that prices started going up for main commodities, rice, wheat, corn, sometime 2005, 2006. Now we're seeing a decrease.
Right.
Do you see a cyclic nature between the primary commodities and then maybe secondary and tertiary commodities like barley, millets, oats, things that we used to consume, for example, in developing country? I know in India, they used to consume a whole lot of sorghum, which now in the last 25, 30 years has replaced the rich man's crop. So do you see a cyclic nature given that both of them might be a very good economical substitute and an economical substitute?
I'm not sure it's a cyclical of a cyclical nature. I think yes. I think definitely you see a change in the production pattern in response to change in relative prices. Absolutely. But by cyclical, I guess you're talking about recurrent things, and I'm not so sure that's what we're seeing. If you see a dramatic increase in wheat production relative to minor grains, that's probably with us. That's probably going to stay with us unless the relative prices change in the other direction. But I don't see a cyclical development, but I do see a trend, very much so. Yeah, you see it in this country as well between corn or maize and soybeans. When the relative prices change, the farmers change the relative acreage they use for those two. There's quite a bit of substitution between those two, much less so with wheat.
Once again, thanks.
Oh, there's one more. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.